Australian military engagement, but now in disaster relief in South Pacific. Please welcome Miranda.
I have some big shoes to fill now. I've got tiny feet and 5 minutes. So let's see how well I do. So I'm going to be talking today about foreign military engagement in HADR, humanitarian and disaster relief, using the case study of Australia in the South Pacific. So the South Pacific, let me start again. Rapid onset natural disaster is a significant security challenge for Pacific Island states and territories. So we have rapid economic growth, urbanization, and land use change that are driving an increase in the frequency, severity of these natural hazard events. So think about things like floods that are impacting Papua New Guinea. And we also have climate change that's contributing to more unpredictable and severe events such as tropical cyclone, and that's impacting countries including Fiji and Tonga. Now, in principle, the government of a disaster-affected state has the primary responsibility to provide emergency relief supported by national and international civilian capabilities. But what we're seeing increasingly is that disaster impact is creating a gap between humanitarian need and available international and national civilian capacity to respond. And in this situation, foreign military assets, or FMA, are vital to provide relief. Now, the South Pacific is also a region of enduring strategic importance to Australia, and traditionally Australia has used defence assistance, including HADR, to secure its neuro region. And I would argue or hypothesize that Australia deploys FMA in the South Pacific for 3 main reasons. And the first is humanitarian. We use our military assets to meet this humanitarian need. But I would suspect that you cannot separate humanitarian need from Australia's own security interests. So by meeting the needs of an affected population, we can reduce the risk of conflict and instability that could threaten our own security interests in the region. And increasingly, I would say that Australia's interests or Australia's policy in the region deploying HADR is linked to its strategic objectives, in particular soft power. So through this active assistance, we can signal a regional commitment, we can improve weak bilateral relationships. And this is becoming increasingly important due to the changing geopolitics of the region. Now, this is really interesting, I think personally, because the criteria for the deployment and use of FMA is actually quite strict. So FMA should be the option of last resort, and this is a rule that was created by the UN. But I would hypothesize that in practice, foreign military assets do not follow this rule of last resort. And that's because the military is essentially a tool of statecraft. You cannot separate its use from interest and power politics. So instead, I would argue that the deployment of FMA is tied to donors' humanitarian, security, and strategic objectives, but only in disaster-affected states that have strategic significance to the donor. And this is important because there's tension between politics on one hand and the humanitarian imperative on the other. And this can actually impact the effectiveness of FMA to meet a humanitarian need, and in that sense, to advance the interest of the donor. So, at the most basic level, I'm asking, why does Australia deploy foreign military assets? And to answer this question, I'm looking at 4 sub-questions. First is why the deployment of assets has evolved. Traditionally, we saw our military, or traditionally we saw the role of our military as principally for war fighting. Now our policy is to deploy within 36 hours of request for assistance. Second is whether humanitarian need or self-interest is the most significant predictor in the patterns of our military assistance. It's important to test this because, as I said, politics can impact how effectively the assets are actually used on the ground. And finally, is there a gap between the claims that are associated with this policy in terms of the security and soft power benefits to Australia and the actual outcomes in practice? And if there is a gap, what can explain it? So to get to the heart of the research, what we're actually doing is measuring the effectiveness of Australia's policy. And this is difficult because different organisations have different understandings of what effectiveness actually is. What we haven't seen is the perspective of policymakers, defence and humanitarian practitioners coming together to look at the positive and negative impact on states and then the consequences for Australia's policy. Exactly. Yep, okay. Racing ahead. So how are we going to measure effectiveness? First, in terms of humanitarian need, the assets need to be appropriate, and that's tied to the United Nations policy. Second, in terms of soft power potential, key stakeholders need to see Australia's policy as legitimate and having moral authority. So to gather the perceptions of multiple stakeholders, we'll be using mixed methods research and visualizing this data using social network analysis. So to recap, the rule is that foreign military assets should be deployed as a last resort, but in practice, patterns in the deployment of foreign military assets don't conform to the rule of last resort. This indicates that factors in addition to humanitarian need explain decision making. This matters because there could be tension between politics and the humanitarian imperative that impacts the use of foreign military assets to meet a humanitarian need, and in turn to advance the donor's interest. So for our approach, we'll be critically evaluating Australia's policy using mixed methods approaches to track the perceptions of multiple stakeholders towards the appropriateness, legitimacy and moral authority of Australia's policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miranda, for that very good speed presentation in 5 minutes. Yeah? Any questions? Vicky? No? I think we still have like 20 more minutes. Yes, Uji.
Yep. Usually in an emergency response or humanitarian response, you have the civil-military coordination. So the civil one is like the humanitarian clusters, UN agencies and government.
Yeah.
So do you try to link up how the military involved in those clusters, or how would it work?
So in terms of SimCoord or civil military coordination, the way that we're going to measure it, it's important to measure it. SimCoord is really the process that will lead to the success or failure of a HADR operation. But in terms of actual practice on the ground, what I'll be looking at is coordination in terms of coordination of perceptions. So were the assets timely? Did they offer a unique capability? Did they take into account local capacity? Did they support the effective government? And how coordinated are stakeholders' perceptions of the appropriateness of the military? And the reason that we're doing that is because it's very, very difficult to get that actual data from the field unless you're there at the time, and CDU ethics won't let me. Because I can't actually deploy myself into a disaster zone and start interviewing people myself.
Yep.
What we need to do is rely on secondary data and reports and compile those to look at coordination in that sense.
Very good.
Miranda, what is your background? Do you have to declare your personal bias in case if you are an ex service personnel?
So I taught at the Different Schools Academy, Alpha, in Canberra, but I'm actually civilian. Yeah. So yeah, but that's a good point. I would want to. Yeah. Defense probably wouldn't let me say as much.
Just a question. I'll be quick.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm very glad that I actually came here today because it's very enlightening from different perspectives, and some of the things actually resonated with me as well. My question is it part of the scope of your research to see the different kind of response by, say, our assets in different countries, depending on the strategic importance of that country?
Yes, that's right. So yes, we are looking at different countries. Was that your question? Are we looking at the strategic importance?
Yeah.
And how we use assets. So what I'm going to do that is create a database that tests predictors and measures of strategic importance. So what we can do is use geographic distance. Voting patterns at the UN, economic, so your GDP characteristics, also in terms of your liberal governance and your Freedom House Index. So if you have a higher Freedom House Index, are we more likely to send our assets? If we don't get along with the UN, are we more likely to send our assets? Did that answer you?
Yes, you did. Yes, thank you. Now, I'll talk.
What we can do now is I'm going to ask all the presenters to please come in front. We have Tina, Agus, Gazal, Jane to join Miranda. We still have 10 minutes. I think if you guys, then maybe we can have a photo taking for our documentation. But before the photo taking, yeah. So this is an opportunity for us for additional questions that we forgot to raise. Thank you very much, guys, for job well done and for your very generous presentation and time. But I think we still have 10 minutes. Any questions or concern? I think you want to clarify, Ishar?
No.
I'm touching.
Yeah, no, that's fine. No, I just want to thank you, everyone, for this presentation. Such a diverse presentation, quite topical, quite. I also found a common thread in regards to social justice, even the geopoliticalness of it's very worldly. You sort of cover heaps of things. So yeah, no, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Questions, comments, violent reaction, non-violent reaction. Areas for improvement on their methodology, on their framework. Question from our academic chair, from our lecturer here.
Sorry.
One more.
No, I just have.
You guys.
I ran out of time when. Sorry. Agus. Yep. Agus, your presentation. I think you mentioned a few times in regards to the two different systems, legal system, system of justice in regards to customary laws our Indigenous and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people have here, and what we call it white man's law, right? Have you considered or part of your research come across how to resolve if there's a fundamental conflict between the law we say we have here and the law of people who are Indigenous and Aboriginal?
Very interesting.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks,
I cannot go into the law area because I think all these lawyers really around.
Maria in the house.
Yes.
Maria is in the house.
But what I'm actually looking at from a political perspective, as I said, the traditional system itself, it's evolved with time. It is not something that's static. So I believe that in political terms, there are space for the politician to actually look into the system and then incorporate the system as one. As I said before, because Australia actually is years and years, but Timor just start now, why don't we look into this now rather than leave it, and until then we just start to see, oh, this is Timorese, another one is Timorese, but with a different system. Why don't just now start to look into this as put in one system, and then later on people say that this is one system. We don't have the two systems.
Good. You have a question from Rajiv.